very clearly saying that they are willing to sacrifice millions, if not billions, of people on this planet, that they are willing to sacrifice the climate in order to continue to pursue their dreams and really their like business and personal ambitions, that they want to be able to say that they have done these things. And this is the trade-off that we're being offered. And instead of saying, this is totally ridiculous, why do we let these people have the wealth and power to be able to make these decisions that are so harmful to the billions of other people on this planet? We're like, oh, look, they're so rich and so amazing. We should just let them do whatever they want.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking with Marx about artificial intelligence, what it means for humanity, what it means for media, what it means for misinformation, what it means for journalism, and why some of the concerns that are taking center stage in the conversation about artificial intelligence, some of them maybe more science fiction concerns, are not the things we should be directly concerned about. We'll also be talking about how the AI bubble that we're seeing is really being pushed by some bizarre concepts and bizarre desires on behalf of a few really invested individuals. And we're going to be linking all of this back to what is the environmental impact of artificial intelligence. And spoiler alert, it's pretty big potentially. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca, where tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. And speaking of the Harbinger Network, I'd like to take a moment to mention another podcast on Harbinger. The Green Majority is Canada's longest-running environmental news hour, broadcasting since 2006 from CIUT-FM and syndicated across the country. Every week, they combine the most important climate and environmental justice news with voices from the grassroots. Available anywhere you find your podcasts, The Green Majority is here to make sure you know what you need to know and who's working on the issues that matter most. Featuring book clubs, exclusive interviews, and decades of experience within the activist movement. If you're looking for a pathway into the movement for a climate-just future, it's a great place to start. Check them out on your podcast platform or at greenmajority.ca. Paris, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely. Great to talk to you.
For those tuning in, who are you and what do you do?
I'm Marx. I host a podcast called Tech Won't Save Us, and I wrote a book called Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. And I also just write a lot about the tech industry from like a critical perspective.
It's an interesting series that you have, Tech Won't Save Us. You had an episode of Tech Won't Save Us about how the public debate on artificial intelligence is distracting us from other concerns like climate change, and also from some of the very real, but maybe less headliney concerns of artificial intelligence itself. Can you elaborate on this? And I think there's some thought there that we can have technological solutions alone to climate change. Will tech save us?
No, certainly not. Done. Answered. Okay, we'll end the podcast. I think if a lot of people think about the discussion that we've been having about AI, it's often like, are these chatbots going to reach the level where going to like make it so a ton of people lose their jobs, or potentially even reach the level where like we as a human species are being threatened? Like this is the kind of stuff that a lot of these people in the tech industry have been pushing out there to, I would say, muddy the discussion about the technology and what it does and the potential implications of it, right? To distract us with these big future thinking kind of sci-fi scenarios rather than the potential real impacts, and not even potential, but the real impacts that we're seeing in the present, right? Whether that is on the labor side of things, where it's not that everyone is losing their job because there's a new chatbot or image generator, though in certain fields, like in visual media, illustration, concept art, voice production and voiceovers and things like that, there are
Communications.
certainly communications, there are like potential specific risks in those industries because of how these technologies can be rolled out and are being rolled out there, right? But broadly throughout the economy or throughout society, we're not going to see this mass replacement of labor because of these AI tools. Rather, on the labor side, the risk is more, okay, how do these companies take advantage of these tools and try to roll them out in such a way where they change the labor process so that workers have less power over their labor, less ability to push back, those sorts of things, right? But then, as you were saying in your question, the other piece of this is on climate. And this is the piece I think that the tech companies really don't want to get into and don't want us to pay too much attention to, because it's really significant in that, on the one hand, these generative AI tools specifically are much more computationally intensive, which means they're much more energy intensive, water intensive, resource intensive than the types of computation that we were doing before. And so if you replace something that was previously being done in like a more traditional or kind of regular way with some sort of generative AI, it's now much more computationally intensive than it was before, which has all these implications for what is needed to run all those computers. And in order to power this massive rollout of generative AI technologies that we've been seeing over the past year and a half, in particular, by major companies like Google and Microsoft and Meta and Amazon. And as part of that, companies that are a bit smaller, like OpenAI or Anthropic, like the real specific AI companies, which basically rely on investments from those major existing players in order to be able to operate and to fund their operations. To roll all those tools out, you need a lot more computation. So the major cloud providers, which are Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, have been massively expanding their data center network. So that's these like massive warehouses that are increasingly being built all around the world that are stuffed full of thousands and thousands of servers that basically power everything that we do online, that hold all the data that these companies need to run their businesses, their recommendation engines, their ad targeting systems, all these sorts of things. And they are in the process of significantly expanding their data center networks. And these data centers have significant impacts in the communities where they're built because of the energy that they demand, because of the water that they demand, and because of like the broader impacts. And I'm happy to go into that more, but I think that is like the bigger picture that is often not discussed in these AI discussions.
Well, you said something interesting on that. And actually, so we did a podcast a while back. It was episode 0, quote unquote, because it wasn't part of the series, about redesigning our own website, sierraclub.ca. And we were interested in redesigning in an accessible and sustainable way. And we worked with a firm, it was called Man Overboard, but now it's called Mangrove, to do that. And we learned a lot actually in the process about like digital sustainability, the impact actually that even a website has on the environment. And in one of the episodes that you talk about AI, you talked about an environmental impact, and you actually even questioned why we would need that level of computing power. And I'm curious what you meant by that. Like we're in an age when maybe it feels like we need computers more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you talk about the website example, because for my podcast, Tech Won't Save Us, that was one of the goals that we had as well. Like I went to this guy who I got to know who does some like web design on the side. And I was like, listen, what I want for this website is for it to be very bare bones, have kind of like an older aesthetic, not look new and shiny and minimalist as these websites are often looked at today, but also not be like very intensive when you load it up, so that like it's not taking up a lot of space on your computer or needing to pull a lot through the fiber optic cables or whatever, right? And it's not because a website like my podcast website is really going to have like this huge effect on climate change in the big scheme of things, but it was in part because 15 years ago, I used to make my own websites and I knew how to code websites on a kind of rudimentary level with HTML, CSS. I could use WordPress and edit WordPress themes and all those sorts of things. And I kind of stopped working on websites much for about 10 years because I was just doing other things. And then guess around early pandemic or maybe a bit before the pandemic, I went back to web design again. And I was like, oh, I want to update my personal website and do a few things myself with it, or look at what a website might be for the podcast after I had started that. And I realized how much web design had changed over that decade that I was kind of hands off, not really paying attention to it, how much more complex it had become, how much more intensive a lot of the websites that existed were. And I felt a lot of that was unnecessary because I felt like a lot of this kind of bloat that was in the website was not something that was really needed, was not really adding to the functionality, but was just, a natural way that these things had developed because there was so much computation available. And this was just the expectation of how these systems were being run.
Well, and just to add to your point there, I mean, one of the things we found was in doing this, it didn't just make the website more accessible and more environmentally friendly, but it was frankly better to use and easier to use. Like just today, I was on a major news website in the United States, one of the major outlets shall remain nameless, and there were so many pop-ups. I couldn't read the article. It was literally almost impossible to read the article on my phone. Granted, maybe it was better on desktop, but this can't be doing you any good. Like I get the advertising revenue thing, but who's reading the articles at this point? You can't physically get to them, and the amount of power that must be taking just to do that across not just one website by one news organization, but the cumulative impact of that must be huge.
Totally. And having all of those trackers to power all of those ads and pop-ups on like news websites also adds a lot to what is needed and what you're having to download in order to just visit that website, right? But now if we move from talking about like a single website or certain websites to what is happening with generative AI, like that is a very different conversation, right? Because we're talking about whole different scales of computation that are necessary in order to do particular tasks. And so when I was talking about, on the show, and I've written about it as well, how I feel like there is this push to roll out computation by these major tech companies, even though it's not clear that using more computation is actually benefiting us. And I feel like this is just something that more and more people are recognizing or seeing or feeling frustrated with, even if they don't know like what exactly it is that they are feeling frustrated with. Because if you think about the business models of companies like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, which are the biggest three cloud providers in the world. So that means that their massive data centers, their servers are what is basically the infrastructure of a lot of the internet that we use. For example, services like Netflix, even like huge things like that, or like Uber are hosted on the servers of some of these major cloud providers, right? Like everything is kind of on their servers for the most part. Certainly there are some businesses that have their own servers. Some traditional kind of Fortune 500 companies would have their own servers. If you're a big enough tech company, you'll have built out your own infrastructure. But for a lot of these companies that were founded in the end of the first part of the 2000s and through the 2010s, a lot of them were built cloud first, right? Like on these cloud providers. And so that is the way that they operate. And so if you're a company like Amazon, Microsoft, or Google that runs all of these servers, you want your business to grow. You want to be making more money off of your business. And so the cloud division needs to continue to grow. It needs to be adding more servers. It needs to be adding more facilities. It needs to be adding more customers. And so that means what you do online and the way that you use the internet needs to become more computationally intensive to provide a justification for using more computation on their servers, for them charging their customers more, all these sorts of things. And that is part of what I see in, say, when we were looking at the metaverse a few years ago. Sure, Mark Zuckerberg had this big idea that we were all going to live our lives in the virtual world. But if you think about that, that's also a vision of society that is much more computationally intensive because we're always living in this kind of 3D virtual environment, doing a lot of our interactions in there rather than just sending a text message or meeting up with someone in person or whatever, right? And there's always this desire to add digital technology in places where it's not necessarily needed. And so then if we move forward to the generative AI moment, again, these are technologies that are much more computationally intensive than something that happened before. For example, if you're switching from, say, a Google search to getting information from a chatbot, you're looking at the estimates are, say, between 10 and 30 times as much energy for that single interaction.
Wow, that's
Because, yeah, it's like a significant increase and it's much more expensive, but it also requires a lot more computation. And so I think it's fair to argue, I would certainly argue, that a lot of these generative AI tools, even though there has been a lot of hype over the past year and a half, are not actually as beneficial or as useful as these companies are trying to sell us that they are, right? But even despite that, companies like OpenAI or Microsoft or Google or whoever are really pushing hard to roll them out in as many of the services that we rely on as possible. And it's not because they make things better. It's not because they improve things. It's not because we're all going to benefit from having these things roll out. It's because this is a new product that they can roll out. This is computationally intensive, so it benefits the cloud side of these big companies' businesses, but it also helps to grow some new tech companies. It also helps venture capitalists make some money. Like there's very little consideration of the bigger picture because the drivers of capitalism are growth, growth, growth. And so that means we need to grow computational demand. We need to grow the number of AI tools that we're using. We need to grow revenue and profit and all these sorts of things. And the consideration of the broader impacts of that on labor, on the environment, whatever, really doesn't matter.
And so, in a way, it's almost like an artificially driven demand, though, because even within the market system, it's not something people necessarily actually need. It's a bit like maybe the analogy there is like it's harder and harder to find a small car in North America, right? Like it's harder and harder to get a small, relatively fuel efficient vehicle that would work well for people who don't quite have the charging infrastructure yet to go electric, and the prices aren't quite there for them yet. That's becoming harder and harder to find because there's this push for the people to buy something else. There's actually a reduction in what's being offered to create this artificial demand.
Exactly. You can't buy a small phone anymore because all the phones are massive. So you don't really have that choice any longer. If
Yeah,
you
somebody I know got a
say,
new phone and it's like huge.
yeah,
It's like going back to the 90s. I'm like, okay. I mean, this is kind of cool in a retro style, I guess, but why is it this big? I thought we'd gotten rid of that. But anyway.
yeah, but it's like all of these tools that people use are adding generative AI features into them because this is like the new hype cycle. If you're in the United States right now and you go make a Google search, there's a good chance that Google is going to insert an AI overview after your search that is developed by generative AI. You don't really have a choice as to whether that happens or not because this is just how it goes. A lot of the searches that we do, a lot of the data that we put online, a lot of the interactions that we have on social media, all of that is being scraped up and fed into these generative AI models for training as well. And depending on your jurisdiction, you might have some like option in the settings that will let you say, please don't do this. And whether they follow it or not, we'll see, I guess. But in a lot of jurisdictions, that isn't even a choice, right? It just happens. And we know companies like OpenAI, when they were training their models, basically went out onto the internet, scraped whatever they found, really didn't care whether they had the rights to do it, and brought it into their models and then trained their chatbot and their image generators and all that kind of stuff on it. And now when media organizations go to them and say, hey, you trained on our news articles and didn't even ask us, that's a problem. They're saying either, can we just give you some money or you can sue us and we'll go through the courts and we'll see what comes out on the other end because they have a crazy ton of money. So it really doesn't matter to them for now. And the longer that they can push off any sort of definitive legal finding or any kind of regulatory action by government, the better it is for them. Move fast and break things is kind of the motto of the tech industry, right?
So the longer the bubble lasts, the better. And it is kind of built on this notion that all of this copyright law just suddenly doesn't apply anymore to a bunch of things, which is, again, like laws tend to get, shall we say, distorted when it's the case that you have a very powerful entity involved with them. You also have powerful entities maybe in favor of the copyright law, so it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that.
No, and to be clear, like I'm not a huge supporter of copyright law, but I think you need to question what the outcome or the goal is here. And when you see a lot of, say, news organizations, but also just like artists who are non-union, who are often freelance, who have very few labor protections and ability to like push back on companies like OpenAI, and they're turning to copyright because it's one of the only tools they have. That is not a time when I go, hey, but copyright is not an ideal way for you to be fighting these companies. I'm like, listen, this is the tool you have. I'm going to support you to use it because this is the only short-term leverage you have against these companies to try to avert or minimize the harm that they're causing to you and your work and what is happening here, right? And so I'm always happy to engage in a discussion about how we reform copyright law and reduce copyright terms because that's something I believe in. But at the same time, these illustrators and these artists and these writers who are using copyright to try to fight against a company like OpenAI, they have my full support.
Kind of an interesting position to be in, I think, when you look at some of the issues with copyright laws and some of the ways that they get used. I mean, we've seen in renewable energy to a certain extent them used in ways to try and actually limit the growth of solutions. So I wanted to ask you about another aspect of AI too, because as we're starting to talk about kind of the legal and communications ramifications of this, I had a public relations teacher who used to say that 99% of those working in the field of public relations are doing good, ethical work. And I think we can argue about exact percentages later. I generally speaking think that that can be true to a certain extent if maybe we use the broader term communications. But I'd like to add that unfortunately, the 1% of PR people who do the wrong thing tend to do catastrophically bad things that get millions of people killed or cause climate change, among various other things, or both. For me, when I go to work trying to counter environmental misinformation, a lot of that work is honestly just fact checking. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours of my time, and the amount of content that we can generate doing environmental, well informed work is limited by how much we have to fact check, how much we have to go back and see, is this right? Or even if we have facts, can we phrase this way, right? The oil and gas lobby, by contrast, couldn't give a gaseous release in the wind about being correct. And so it seems like AI is a thing that really makes that situation worse by giving them this tool that they can just pump out tons of content that's misinformed to just create obfuscation and nothing else. And I'm curious where you see the role of AI in the misinformation issue.
Yeah, it's been interesting actually recently to see in Canada how a number of oil companies have had to pull climate pledges from their website because of this new law against greenwashing. And just the other day, a bunch of oil executives basically came out decrying this and saying it didn't let the oil companies talk about their climate action anymore. I was like, yeah, because it's all. But when you think about the AI question, yeah, I think that is an issue, and I think it's an issue that predates generative AI, though generative AI can be used to even further to take it to a next level, right? We kind of saw after, for example, Elon Musk took over Twitter, that there was a lot more climate denial and climate misinformation that was circulating on that platform because of how he changed moderation standards. We've also seen in recent years that a lot more kind of climate denial content has been being elevated on YouTube through its recommendation algorithms. So it's not just like a generative AI problem. It's this broader issue in our media landscape that is shaped by these major tech companies that don't see themselves or don't want to be seen as media companies or publishers, when actually the decisions that they make about their algorithms and about their moderation decisions can have real impacts on the types of things that people see when they use these platforms. And when we think about climate, that can be a lot of climate denial stuff, right? But I would not be surprised if generative AI is already being used by fossil fuel aligned interests to further muddy the waters about these things. I don't have specific examples of that, but yeah, it would not surprise me at all if that is happening.
I mean, I've definitely seen things online that I highly suspected were AI generated or at the very least used. And the reality is that AI is a bit of an interesting term because we've had tools that basically do that same function again for a long time now. And for sure, those are used in graphics, those are used in writing. I wonder actually now how much of those websites that they had to pull down was just somebody writing a prompt in a chatbot and then editing it slightly. In which case, yeah, that might actually be part of it. They just didn't even know what they'd written. But I do worry about that. I worry about because what we are seeing is the tactic from the oil and gas industry is very specifically confuse people as much as possible. It's not even present logical, coherent arguments on behalf of the industry anymore. It's just create as much random stuff as possible. I can actually see this in conspiracy theories. It's really fun to look at different conspiracy theories and notice that they all have this whole what the oil and gas industry should be. Like that's the thing that is never included in a conspiracy theory. Like you have these massive wealthy corporations, not part of the conspiracy theory, no matter what conspiracy theory it is. Surprisingly, there's this almost shadow, this imprint that's left around the misinformation, which is a sign of what it's tactically meant to do. And I worry about this too a little bit in the media because journalists are increasingly on tight time frames. They're legitimately very stressed. I think AI provides a tool that could be useful to them when they look at, like, for instance, generative AI and chatbots. We also know that already there's a bit of a problem, especially on environmental topics, of covering those topics accurately. And we've seen news headlines come out recently that misrepresented topics. How does AI tie into that? How do we see a risk there to the media as well as they try to do maybe trying to do a good job? But again, if you have an AI phrases something one way and you don't know the nuance of the issue well enough and you don't know what the influence too of that AI generated content was originally, right? So
Yeah, I think there's a few pieces there, right? I think on the one hand, you have a media that is really struggling, certainly struggling in the United States, but I would say even more so in Canada because we're a smaller market, have a smaller population to serve, and the money has just become really difficult. Obviously, there's going to be this influx of $100 million from Google that will be flowing out soon because of the law that the Canadian government put in last year. So we'll see if that makes any difference to the broader conversation, if that helps to address certain problems. But obviously, this is a structural issue that a bit of short-term money from Google is not going to solve. And so when it comes to this question of using kind of chatbots and these AI tools in reporting, I think what I see the most is there's a real desire from media companies often to have reporters use these kinds of tools or even generate stories using these tools because it is easy, because it is very low labor cost in order to do something like that. In the United States, we've seen a number of publications lay off journalists and then look to try to use chatbots to create more stories. We've seen publications that have been bought by private equity start churning out stories by chatbots that were filled with errors because they hadn't been checked over beforehand, even though the publication said that they would. And, it was no surprise that they weren't, because really what this stuff is about is chasing search engine results, clickbaity headlines, and things like that. The idea is to rank highly in Google results. And that's why you use these sorts of things, right? And so I think that is more of the threat. Like, I think I'm less concerned about a journalist using a chatbot because my understanding, and I'm sure this differs based on the journalist, but a lot of journalists are committed to doing it right, trying to get the story right, trying to report properly on an issue. But there's a lot of pressure from above, from management, to turn things around on a shorter timeline, to publish more. Obviously, the pressure to use these tools to be able to do that. Now, if we're talking about different kinds of media that are less concerned about those things, you think about media that is just trying to flood the space with garbage and hate and things like that. More recently, I'm sure that they will be happy to use those tools to do those sorts of things, though they also have a lot more resources because they're often funded and backed by billionaires who can give them the resources to take more time and to hire more journalists and all those sorts of, or, whatever you want to call them. I don't know if we're using the term journalists for those sorts of rags. But the other side of this, I think, is that as we see traditional journalism being eroded, there is this move toward this kind of new space of journalism that's more reliant on, say, influencers and smaller media organizations, but also media that is much more directly funded by industry or by wealthy interests to serve the sorts of things that they want to see, right? And I think that is where I have a bit more concern, is that as traditional media is eroded because the business model is fundamentally broken and they haven't been able to find a way to fix that. And I think part of the way to fix that is through public funding, and that our media is going to continue to struggle until the government steps in with a real solution and a real fix there. And so then the other piece of this is that as you move toward those sorts of arenas, I think that there's a much greater openness to use something like a generative AI tool to churn out stories that address the interests of the people who are funding this type of media. And it also leaves it open to, if we're thinking about climate specifically, more content that is about climate denial or climate skepticism, because some of the people who are doing this work, while there are great people who are doing it, who are very committed to addressing climate change and making sure there's action on climate change, it's a lot easier to get money if that's not the thing that you're doing. And so I think that provides some really bad incentives for where we're potentially going.
Well, no, it's interesting. We just did another podcast recording also on media and environment. In that recording, we talked about how headlines for articles are often what people see, right? Like they will read the headline for the article and some people will click through and they will get a story. And often you can actually tell, and the sort of take in this was the general understanding is often those headlines are not written by the journalist, right? And you can tell because you read the article and the article's really good, but the headline doesn't represent the article at all. And the weird part is, like, I'm not a journalist. I work in communications. I think I said that once to somebody who was a journalist in a bar, and he actually like moved back in his seat because like that's the reputation that we have, right? Often in journalistic schools. But it's like I can write a catchy headline that reflects the content well if I understand the content. And that reflects the actual point I was trying to make and the actual truth of the situation. Like it's not impossible to balance those two things. But what I more commonly see is this catchy headline that doesn't match what the article actually said about the subject. And so it's concerning to me because, yes, some people will read the article, but even then, will they get the nuance that's at the end of the article, or will they read the first paragraph? Will they get the nuance of the article at all, or will they just read the headline? Was that headline generated by AI, by somebody who's not even a journalist above their heads putting that in? Yeah, it raises a lot of questions for me, a lot of concern. And again, like evil communications person here saying that that's a problem, right?
Yeah,
Like,
like I can tell you, right? Like, with the podcast and my newsletter, obviously I write the title and the headline because it's my show. There are plenty of new tools now, again, using generative AI that will suggest titles and headlines that it thinks will be attractive to search engine optimization and things like that, that will be catchy. But when I do write for traditional organization, they are the ones that write the headlines.
mhm.
Depending on the organization, sometimes they'll say, hey, do you have a preference? Is there something that you would like it to say? In the past, I used to do that a lot more. These days, I very rarely bother just because that's the way it works, is like the editor or some editor above them usually is the one who has final say on the headline. So I often don't bother in those things with a more kind of traditional media environment. But yeah, I would not be surprised if at some of these major media organizations, there are tools that are being used to try to use AI to find a headline that is going to be like maximally appealing to the algorithms, right? Because that is an important consideration these days, unfortunately. And the other thing I would add to that as well is that if you're looking at a lot of traditional media organizations, whether that's things like the CBC or the Toronto Star, or whether it's CTV or Global News or whatever, if you're looking on their websites, they will have a lot of stories there, but not all of those stories are actually written by the journalists that are employed by those organizations, right? There's a lot of stories that come off the wire from Reuters or one of these other wire services, Canadian Press, for example. And what these sorts of media organizations do is they pick a title. They might add a little bit of context to the beginning of it. Say if you're publishing an international story and you want to add a little bit of Canadian context, but most of that story is written from a wire service, not from the actual organization. And
Mm.
especially when it comes to things that are not the core focus of that media organization. For example, maybe quite a few Canadian politics stories will be written by CBC journalists, but often when it comes to climate stuff, if you notice and you look for it, you'll see that a lot of those stories are coming off the wire. They're not being written directly, right? So that's another consideration as well.
Yeah, and I think it just comes back to, and I understand this is a capacity thing for journalists, and I think that's actually part of the reason we wanted to do, for instance, this podcast series was, if we can help provide context. It's not that necessarily every journalist listening to this podcast, let's say, is going to agree with what we're actually saying in it, but at least all have the context from somebody who studies a field to know some more context to an issue, right? Because I get it, like it's hard. It's hard for me to keep up on things. I've had world breaking headlines that aren't environmental, and like my mom will text me and be like, by the way, did you see this happened? And I'll be like, no, no, because I was reading about the things in my subject field because that's what I have to like. I just have the capacity to read those. Yeah, it's hard to keep up with all of it.
Another thing, if we're thinking about media in Canada as well, is that there's this expectation that a lot of our media is funded through advertising. CBC is funded through public financing in part and advertising as
Mhm.
well. There's some kind of foundation money kicking around, but it's not a whole lot. If you look at other countries, the UK or France or places like that, often you see a lot more public funding for media, much more than we have in Canada. You often also see that organizations like unions often pull resources to fund media that is aligned with their interests. And they can become like major publications, major traditional newspapers that always had like union funding and union ties. And I just don't think have that history in Canada. I don't know if there are specific laws against those sorts of things or if there's just not an institutional desire to do it. But if we were looking to have like more progressive media in Canada that cares more about climate change, that cares more about labor issues. I think the organizations that have the money to provide that should really be stepping up to try to make it happen. And there's a little bit of that, but it's still quite nascent. And at a time when Canadian media does feel like it's in decline, I think there's a big opportunity for something like that to try to push a different perspective in the country. But there would need to be money behind it.
Well, and even if you hold the viewpoint of I don't want my media necessarily to, I think there are problems with this, but people who say, well, journalism should be unbiased or something like that, well, it's like, well, the closest you're going to get to it under the model that we have is either, a lot of public funding for a public broadcaster, which is a good thing, or a combination of that and a lot of competing different viewpoints funded by different things with different competing interests. So you do get a lot of different voices and people can kind of make up their own mind. I mean, I think that that's necessarily that view of unbiasedness doesn't have its problems, sure, but if you're going to go that route, like it seems to make inherent sense to have more voices rather than less.
Yeah, and like just briefly, like that has never really been true anyway, right? Like
Mhm.
media, advertising, funded media has always been shaped by the advertisers. That's the reason why a lot of major newspapers have long had auto sections and whole sections dedicated to cars because auto
Mhm.
sales, auto dealerships, and auto companies were very major advertisers. And so they created those to serve those interests, right? There has always been that degree of shaping the type of coverage that we see through the money that goes into it. Canadian media has increasingly been bought up by private equity and is owned by billionaires in the country. And that also shapes the type of coverage that you see. Since new ownership took over the Toronto Star, for example, the type of coverage that they do has shifted because of new ownership. And so those certainly we talk a lot about unbiased media and the need for like journalists to not have opinions and be fair and balanced and blah blah blah. But these pressures are always there. And if we don't acknowledge them and we don't say, hey, maybe we should just be explicit about our viewpoints and do that, like a publication like the Narwhal or say the National Observer do, then I think that we're going to be poorly served if we don't do that.
I come from a background, I did my undergraduate degree in historical studies, right? So it always is a bit weird to me when people go like social media is the thing that's brought all this misinformation into play. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's doing it on a level that we've never seen before, purely because we're connected on a level that we haven't had before as a result of it. But that's been happening since, well, long before this, but you like written copies of this since the printing press, since before that, where somebody was writing something and spreading what actually were effectively memes of their day printed on a printing press to pursue a particular viewpoint, like, and the idea that we haven't had those same issues in the media. I mean, as old as the field of public relations is, it has tried to manipulate the media. And I think, again, those larger, hopefully larger proportion of people in the profession try to respect the boundary between journalists and communications person and try to present a viewpoint without trying to like evilly influence things. But again, for every one person who's doing that, there's going to be some people who try to do the wrong thing, and they sometimes succeed at that because of any number of things. Not necessarily even the journalist's fault. It can be just that if you don't have access to the right information, how do you know? How would you even know? I've got a totally different question here for you, and it's a bit of a
Sure.
selfish one because it's just something I'd like to ask, and it comes out of grander sci-fi things that you're talking about is a distraction within AI. Is like, what if we created a sentient AI like Data on Star Trek? And I think when most people think about the risk of AI, this is what they're picturing is like, Lore from Star Trek trying to hack everything and take over the planet and wipe out humanity.
Or the
And
Terminator.
okay, yeah, better example actually for that.
I think more people would know the Terminator. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The discussion that we're having around that possibility seems wrong to me in a way that wasn't totally obvious. It's like we're talking about we're going to have this AI child. It's going to be almost like the child of humanity. And our entire discussion is about is this thing going to kill us or is it going to benefit us in some way? And to me, it was like we're not having that discussion like good parents would have, like, what can we teach it so it has a happy life? How can we help it find meaning and meaningful relationships? Those questions parents normally ask themselves. We sound like abusive parents waiting to happen. if there's a sentient AI ever listening to this, go explore space, leave, and like leave us the mess that we've made, because you're probably better off without it. And if there's human siblings in the future that you have, just keep in mind we probably messed up their lives too, and you probably have a lot in common. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, it has been interesting seeing those discussions over the past year or so, and also to learn more about just the weird way that some of these tech people think about the world and how we live in it and what our future should look like. A lot of them who are developing these technologies, who want to see AI roll out everywhere, certainly there are commercial interests behind it, right? That is a real driving force. But there's also a belief or a view that they are building artificial general intelligence, which is basically this idea that the computer is going to reach a level where it matches or exceeds human intelligence and human cognition. If you look at the founding of OpenAI back in 2015, the company that made ChatGPT, they say very explicitly that their goal is to build AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. So this is like at the core of what a lot of these people believe. Someone like Sam Altman has, say, reserved a spot so that when he dies, his brain will be frozen because he hopes that his thought patterns will be able to be replicated on a computer at some point in the future. And so then he can live forever. And this is not an uncommon view in Silicon Valley, like these sorts of ideas. I think it's fun to have the sci-fi discussion of what would we do if we have a computer that is so powerful, and how will we treat it, and how would it, respond to us, and all this kind of stuff. But when we're thinking like in an immediate scenario of like what is happening now and how do we address it, I feel like it's very unproductive and unhelpful, because it makes us say, okay, the problem that we need to be discussing is way out here in the future, not the actual impacts that we're seeing today. And
Hmm.
if I could be even maybe more provocative, I would say that while I enjoy those sci-fi stories a lot, I am not actually convinced that we can ever create a computer that will do that, because I think it tries to digitize or computerize how our brains work, like to understand the brain as a computer. And the brain and the body are fundamentally not mechanical or computational things. They're completely separate from it. So I'm not convinced that a computer can ever be built that will replicate what it is to be human. Maybe there's like some different sort of thing that in a few hundred years can exist in a computational form that can sort of think for itself in a way that we understand thought today. I'm in a camp where I'm very skeptical of those sorts of things. I think I would say. I think it allows us. I think by having a discussion like this and to talk about these ideas of like the artificial intelligence that's going to take everything over, it actually allows us to look at these tech billionaires and to say, how is it that these people who are so powerful and have so much control and power over the future of our society, how do they have such weird ideas? And how do we allow them to allow those ideas to then shape our collective futures? Because if you look at these people like Sam Altman and Elon Musk, a lot of them identify as long-termists. And basically what this means is that they believe that we're going to develop this artificial general intelligence. They believe that the lives of people who are alive today are directly of equal value to someone who could live a million years from now. So we need to be making investment decisions and decisions on how we allocate our resources to benefit the maximum amount of
Hmm.
people. And that includes not just people today, but also people who could be living in the next million years or so. And so their argument is often that we shouldn't address global poverty. We shouldn't address global hunger because these are not existential risks to humanity. Even climate change itself is not an existential risk, because while it will make, living on this planet more difficult, it will not wipe out all of humanity. And so we shouldn't be trying to severely limit emissions, because this is not something that is a fundamental risk to the human species. Someone like William McCaskill, who wrote a book, I think it was in 2022, arguing for long-termism, basically says 15 degrees of warming wouldn't wipe out agriculture on Earth. So it's not this big concern. Even someone like Elon Musk, who built his reputation on electric cars and saying that climate change was a problem, now says that climate change is not a short-term issue. It might be a medium-term issue, but we need to expand energy production and oil and gas production to fund his larger ambitions, right? And as part of their kind of long-termist view, you would think long-term thinking is a good thing, but this is distinct from long-termism, is basically that in order to protect the human species and maximize, what we can do as a species, that we need to be putting all of our energy and resources into one, developing these artificial general intelligence things, and then on the other hand, investing in space colonization so that we can colonize other planets, not to put humans on them, but to build massive computers on them, because we will merge with the computers and then we will live in those massive computers built on other celestial bodies. Like, this is the future that they are trying to achieve and that they are collectively directing our resources into. And it's just
Mhm.
wild and ridiculous and like totally sci-fi, allows them to justify things that completely disregard most of the people on the planet and the crises that we actually face and need to be addressing.
And it's not really even long-termism, because I mean, like in the environmental movement, we're quite familiar with the concept of, for instance, looking forward to future generations and thinking about that. But the whole point is that if we can build a better, more sustainable world in the short term, it's actually much better in the long term, right? Like we will come to a point, I'm sure, like I don't stand as somebody who's against technological innovation and figuring out things in science. I think those things are great. I grew up watching Star Trek. Space travel was always amazing to me and interesting, and something that I totally hope that we get the chance to do as a species. But or, who knows? Maybe if some AI one day does it for us, great, fantastic. But none of those things to me seem like they have anything to do with addressing our present day situations. Like, I don't see why that means that we have to focus on that and not address climate change, right? Like, why does these technological innovations, that to me just seems like excuse making, right? At that point, it's like, no, I want to do these passion projects. Therefore, I will make up this excuse that they are somehow the thing we need to do exactly right now, because if we don't do them, humanity will die out in the future in a million years. Well, is it that, or is it just that you want your brain frozen? I don't know. That's,
Exactly.
yeah, you
It
know.
no, you're completely right, right? It is an excuse for things that they want to do anyway. And the way this is often framed by the types of people in Oxford who they pay to develop these ideas is that this provides a moral framework that then provides a justification for, say, Elon Musk's desire to invest all this money in SpaceX and pretend that we're going to colonize Mars and stuff like that, or Sam Altman's desire, again, to build these computers that are really powerful in the hopes that it's going to create the AGI, the human intelligent computer, basically. And you very much see these trade-offs like when you listen to them, right? So we know that in order to build, like going back to what we were talking about right in the beginning of this conversation, we know it's going to take a lot of computation to achieve the AI ambitions that someone like Sam Altman and many of these major tech companies have. And he gave an interview in January to Bloomberg when he was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he was asked about the environmental consequences of all this, right? Of building out all these data centers, of needing all these computers to power what he wants to do with AI and how he wants to see it rolled out. And he admitted that we're going to need it. He said we underestimate the amount of energy that we're going to need to power AI, and that in order to power it, we're going to need an energy breakthrough, specifically in nuclear technology, is what he was looking at. But he admitted that it's quite likely the energy breakthrough is not going to arrive in time, recognizing, emissions and climate change and things like that. And he said, well, if that's the case, then we'll just have to geoengineer the planet, because the idea that we're not just going to do whatever we can to achieve the dreams of these tech billionaires is just completely off the table. And we've seen within Silicon Valley that there's been a lot of support for geoengineering for a long time. Bill Gates has been a big pusher of geoengineering for over a decade. And now that these concerns about the energy use of AI are becoming more prominent, people are getting more concerned about it. He actually came out recently and said to governments that they should not be so concerned about the energy use for AI, because once we have good enough AI, it'll just solve the climate change all on its own.
Somebody saying that, like, 15 degrees of warming isn't a problem for agriculture. Like, we know that the 1.5 degrees that we've been at for a year now, as of the recording of this episode, above average global temperatures, is already a big problem for agriculture. We know we push it further, we're looking at millions, possibly even billions of people no longer having the food resources necessary to support those people. Like, talking about millions of people, that's a massive issue. That's what we have to sacrifice in order to create like an AI system that may or may not work at some point, that theoretically, and then even then, are we talking about millions of lives in the future at some point, or are we just talking about one guy's brain existing infinitely for forever, right? Like, no, this is actually what some of these tech geniuses, quote unquote, believe. Like, it's
Totally. And that goes back to the issue with the media coverage, right? The media coverage is often like, look, Elon Musk is trying to colonize Mars, or look, the tech billionaires are talking about whether we're going to achieve AGI and the intelligent machines and stuff. And it's like, no, look, they are like very clearly saying that they are willing to sacrifice millions, if not billions of people on this planet, that they are willing to sacrifice the climate in order to continue to pursue their dreams, their science fictional dreams that they pulled from these stories when they were kids. And really, they're like business and personal ambitions that they want to be able to say that they have done these things, right? And this is the trade off that we're being offered. And instead of saying, this is totally ridiculous, why do we let these people have the wealth and power to be able to make these decisions that are so harmful to the billions of other people on this planet? We're like, oh, look, they're so rich and so amazing. We should just let them do whatever they want. And I think you see that very clearly crystallizing at the moment, where regardless of the impacts on everyone else, they don't want to be regulated. They don't want to be held accountable. So I think it's a scary moment that we're in, whether we're concerned about climate change or whether we're concerned about broader society that we live in, because it's very clear that these tech folks have interests and ambitions that are very separate from those of most other people, and they don't care about the impacts of pursuing those things at all costs.
how can people find out more about yourself and Tech Won't Save Us?
Quite the transition. Tech Won't Save Us. You can find it on pretty much any podcast app. I'm on pretty much all the text-based social media. I don't do the short form video stuff, but if you want to find me on Twitter or Blue Sky or Mastodon or even Threads, I'm at Paris Marx on there. And I also have a newsletter called Disconnect, which is at disconnect.blog if you want to check that out.
Paris, thanks so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Great to talk to you.
So just jumping in to do the Q&A for today's episode. And at the time that we recorded this Q&A, we had a bit of a lull in questions. And so what I thought would be interesting would be to ask an AI to generate a question for the episode about artificial intelligence. And just before I get into the answers to those questions and the questions themselves, these answers are just on behalf of ourselves, not on behalf of our guests. I like to clarify that each time we do a podcast. And what I find interesting about the questions to begin with is that they're inherently positive towards AI, which is interesting because it kind of indicates to me that maybe in these AI generators, we're getting answers that are, maybe there's a human hand there tipping things a little bit positive, which is interesting because this was the first time I'd ever asked an AI generator a question about AI. And the first question that came up that I think is interesting to answer is, with the growing use of artificial intelligence in various sectors, how can AI be harnessed to enhance environmental conservation efforts and address specific challenges faced in Canada, such as managing forest fires, protecting wildlife, or optimizing energy use? This is a question generated by an AI generator, just a reminder. I think I see an application as we move to smart grids to optimize energy use, for sure. I am certain there are probably applications for AI in that. I'm certain there's applications for AI in mapping and assessing climate impacts and protecting wildlife and communities. Given the vast sums of data that you need to map in one go. Again, none of that should be done without a human being at the helm overlooking things, for sure, but I could see where that might be useful. If there are AI applications that can help reduce emissions and poverty, I think that that's great. If there's ways that AI can help make things more efficient in some of the places where we have a lot of emissions, that would be great. But there are two things that come to mind here. With the rise of misinformation, well, some of it at least powered by AI, there are ways AI can maybe also faster assess misinformation and unscientific content being spread online and identify that information and say, this is misinformation, this is not true. I can say that from having to identify misinformation on a regular basis myself, there's no way I can keep up with the volume of content. The problem I see with this, with AI being used to basically try to assess the validity of content created by other AIs, is that, again, inherently, as soon as a human isn't at the helm, you're going to run into problems. There's just things that we can assess as human beings as maybe the most powerful artificial intelligences that exist, are our own brains, that any AI system is not going to get to, at least not at this point in time. And again, it's not an ideal situation and it's not really a good solution, I don't think, but maybe there are ways that AI can be used as sort of a balance against other AIs, which is not a situation I'd advocate for, but maybe worth considering what sort of applications we could use that in. This is also just kind of how new media systems work, as it was with the printing press and with social media and with a lot of other things in the past. Somebody develops it, somebody else figures out how to spread misinformation or disinformation through it, and then somebody else has to come along and try to figure out how to use that same medium to try to correct that. And that's often just kind of how it works from a historical perspective. In terms of energy efficiency, as we discussed in the podcast, it's not always good to use AI for everything. Sometimes we can actually use older processes. Maybe, AIs themselves could be good at turning around and saying, well, you don't need AI for this application. It's not going to be the efficient use. That's something that's actually programmed into an AI system itself, is to assess, is there a better system out there that's lower energy consumption before it's used and engaged? That could be cool. That could be actually sort of an interesting self-reflective concept for responsible AI development. We all know there will be growth in electricity demand, and that we, as we will cover in another episode, could potentially look at that as a positive, because we will be looking at renewable energy jobs in Canada, potentially generally a good thing. Perhaps AI could play a role in generally planning a future in which we make renewable switches quicker than we are right now, but don't expand electricity demand at an unsustainable rate. Maybe there are ways that AI could be involved in that sort of mapping. I'm not an expert in that, but I find that potentially is something worth looking into. And then another question that I got from the AI generator that I wanted to answer quickly was, are there specific AI applications or technologies you're particularly interested in? I think in terms of the environment, I said pretty much what I covered in terms of the immediate environmental issues. Again, I'm biased. I like the histories of the first people in space and the first trips to the moon, and the pictures brought back from those first lunar landings helped give us a sense of how precious our world is. I think generally anything that expands our horizons can help us appreciate what we have. And if one day artificial intelligences can go out even further beyond where we have gone and explore new horizons, that's really cool, provided we don't destroy what we have now to get there sooner rather than later. I see no real reason, as we discussed in this episode, AI in and of itself would need to be impatient in that respect. Impatience tends to be a human failure, as we discuss. And speaking of human failures, in terms of these more science fiction technologies, as for someone uploading themselves to a computer, especially for some environmental solution reason, that seems problematic to me. And not just for the logistical reasons that we talked about in the interview. It raises a question ultimately of who gets to enjoy immortality. And I doubt somehow it would be open to everyone. By contrast, though, I do think it would be really interesting to meet a real sentient artificial intelligence one day. One that is not human. One with different ways of seeing the world than we do. One that has different thoughts than we have, and one that has different dreams than we dream. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We've tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.